Alright, our next episode is called The Bonding. It's episode number 53 for TNG, and it originally aired on October 21st, 1989, and it was written by Ron Moore and directed by Winrich Kolbe. Now, as the story starts out, an away team is conducting an archaeological dig on a planet, and Worf, who's leading the away team, makes an emergency distress call, and Picard has the team beamed directly to sickbay. But one of the members of the away team, Dr. Marla Astor, who was an Enterprise archaeologist, is dead on arrival, according to Dr. Crusher. Now, unfortunately, Picard and Troy are given the responsibility to deliver the news to her son, who is named Jeremy, and Jeremy's father died 5 years before. So now Jeremy is without both of his parents. Now Jeremy is alone in his quarters and reviews old family movies of himself and his mother. And while that's going on, an energy field appears on the planet and leaps toward the Enterprise. Now while that's going on, a simulation of Dr. Astor peeks around the corner and greets him, as you can see in this picture, which is actually, when I first saw this was quite a creepy moment, after having gone through about 15 minutes dealing with her death here. Now the planet below once supported two races of people, one of energy and the other of matter. Now the physical beings battled themselves to extinction, and Dr. Astor was killed when she activated an old landmine from those wars. Now the energy beings refused to allow any more suffering because of the past of those physical beings. On the planet they will create everything needed, the mother, the friends, the wife, children, anything that Jeremy needs to ensure that he is happy. But of course, Captain Picard and Troy struggle to keep Jeremy on the ship, knowing that that's kind of a futile way of living in the fantasy world that the energy beings would create. Now eventually the crew of the Enterprise convinces the energy beings that Jeremy will be loved and well cared for, especially after they bring in Wesley Crusher, and Wesley explains his story about how he had to deal with the death of his own father and his anger at Captain Picard for being the one who lived and his father was the one who died, and just being angry with Picard over that, and eventually Wesley was able to get over that and was able to move on with his life. Well, Jeremy realizes that he has to do the same thing with Lieutenant Worf, who led the away team mission that his mother was on, and he was just angry at Worf that Worf lived and his mother died. But he bonds with Worf because Worf also lost his parents and was raised by humans, and they end the episode by joining together in a bonding ritual, Klingon ritual called Rustai, and they do that together and give their mother, both of their parents really, meaning over this event. So the simulation of Marla Astor evaporates, and that's the end of the episode. Now, this episode has a really interesting backstory to it, and it is written by a writer who I alluded to actually in my introduction to this season, because Patrick Stewart gave Ron Moore some interesting advice when he came to the set one day, and said that one thing Picard doesn't do enough is fight and have sex. So that was his first advice that he gave to Ron Moore as a writer for TNG. But yeah, this was the first one that Ron Moore wrote, and I actually want to read directly out of a book called Captain's Logs. It's I don't know if it's still in print now, but it's called Captain's Logs, The Unauthorized Complete Trek Voyages by Edward Gross and Mark A. Altman. I encourage you to pick it up because that's where I get a lot of my info about these episodes, but this is a fascinating story, so I'd just like to read the excerpt from this about this episode. It says, for the bonding, Michael Piller, I came in without any shows to shoot. There were no stories and no scripts in the works, which is the greatest nightmare you can imagine. There's nothing to fall back on, and the appetite of any weekly show is voracious, because as soon as you've got a script done, you have to have another one right behind it, and it continues that way. I went through every scrap of paper to see what was here from past administrations that I could develop. The first thing that came to my attention, The first thing I saw that had any value was a speculative script that had been sitting around called The Bonding. It appealed to me enormously. It needed a little work and hadn't tied the alien story into the other story quite right. But I liked that show a lot and am very proud of it. I think it struck the heart of Star Trek, exploring the human condition. This was a marvelous example of that. Writer Ron Moore notes that the biggest change in his script was that the boy first learns his mother had been killed. He recreates her on the holodeck. The thing I was playing with is what are the dangers of the holodeck, says Moore. A kid goes in and recreates his dead mother. What do you do in that situation? They felt they didn't want to do another holodeck show at that point, that it moved the focus away from the aliens. What sparked the idea was that we have the shipload of 1,000 people, and this time they've brought their families. It never seems the series has dealt head-on with some of the questions a family ship would inevitably bring up. I wanted to write a story about what happens when someone's mother dies, and what happens to that kid and our family on board the ship. That process naturally led me to Worf, because he's an orphan as well. And it is kind of interesting, Ron Moore saying that and exploring what does a family do in a starship. Because when you think about it, the Enterprise is often in danger, and the fact that so many crew members would be willing to bring their families is a bit puzzling. So he wanted to deal with that. And I think the holodeck scenario would have been interesting. You know, if you did have someone who died, it would be very tempting to use the holodeck to bring them back and almost continue their existence in a way. But they decided they were going to do that by focusing on the aliens more than just a holodeck episode. So that makes sense too, just to give it a little more of a distinct and fresh look than if it would be with the holodeck. Now, what's interesting about Ron Moore, going into his backstory about it, he was dating a girl, and she had previously worked on TNG. I forget what her title was, but when she saw all these posters that Ron Moore had in his room of the original series, she told Ron Moore that he probably could get a tour of the TNG set, because she still had some connections back there. So that's what he did. He was really thrilled by that, and he decided that he was going to bring a script that he had written for the next generation. And he brought it with him, and the person who was giving the tour said, you know, I'm really not supposed to take scripts, this is not just the way it goes. But Ron Moore kept being really enthusiastic about it as the tour was going along. He said, you know, I know I'm not supposed to do this, but I think I'll read it for you. I'll just read it for you. And the guy liked it, doing the tour liked it, and apparently he had some connections with the higher-ups, and this was, Ron Moore got an agent, and the script sat on the shelf for a year, but then when Michael Piller was looking for scripts, he looks at The Bonding, and he gives Ron Moore a call, and says, we're going to do it. So that was Ron Moore's introduction to Star Trek The Next Generation. And Ron Moore wrote another spec script, and eventually was hired on to the writing staff of the third season. So kind of a neat story, and, you know, one of those where it's, you know, you don't think by trying to get somebody to read your script while you're on a tour that anything would come of it. I know a lot of people try to sneak their scripts in any way they can, but it worked in this situation, and in fact, Ron Moore, his success story, opened the door for Michael Piller to really take lots of different spec scripts just to get fresh ideas for new episodes, and a couple people were actually hired for that to be their full-time job, just to read scripts that were submitted. So interesting how that started, a good beginning for Ron Moore, and just a new way of getting episodes. I thought this was a really good episode, and kind of a creepy one, just from, maybe I'm overreacting from this picture that you see here, but I was kind of freaked out by seeing that, and the thought that that this alien was able to take this little boy down to the planet. I thought, you know, Jeremy was a little too willing to go with his mother down to a planet, but hey, you know, if somebody looks and talks exactly like your mother, why not trust her? So, I don't know. Maybe it's just because he's a young boy, but comment below what you think. Do you think this was written pretty well for a 12-year-old boy, or do you think that this was a little bit off? Mixed reviews on that, but overall I think this is a great episode and a good introduction for Ron Moore. Thanks guys, and I'll talk to you soon.